Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a book I finished reading a couple weeks ago called Infant Baptism in the First 4 Centuries by Joachim Jeremias. This is a tiny little book. It's been out for many years at this point. It was originally written in German in 1958, translated into English I think in 1960. So it's been around for quite a long time and is an important, although again, small work on the question of infant baptism and specifically the history of infant baptism in the practice of the early church. So if you are someone who either grew up in a church context where infant baptism was practiced, or maybe especially if you grew up in a context where that's not the norm and you're trying to figure out, why Presbyterians or Lutherans or Roman Catholics or others have baptized infants, it's often a practice that can seem perplexing, strange, and confusing. And so, of course, one of the big questions is, where did this practice come from? Is this something that's gone on for many years? Is it something that developed later on in the history of the church? Is it a recent innovation? And so the historical piece of that question is an important one. Now, I will say a couple of things, just kind of putting on my pastor hat for a moment. As a Protestant, I would very strenuously want to argue that while church history is informative and formative for how we think about these questions, and it's important to look at the history and understand when did certain practices or ideas or teachings come into play, the ultimate battleground, of course, is the testimony of Scripture. And so any question about the historical practice of infant baptism needs to bring that back into the time, not as of the early church after the apostles, but the early church of the apostles as well. We don't want to disconnect these things, right, and drive a wedge between Scripture and history, but neither do we want to subsume theology and exegesis to historical investigation. If we're going to really answer that question of what are the historical roots of infant baptism, we have to look at that from a theological vantage point as well. And that is one of the things that I think is actually a strength of this little book. It's written by a name that's probably not familiar to many of us. Jeremias was a German Lutheran New Testament scholar and theologian in the 20th century. Very impressive man. Grew up in Jerusalem, studied in Leipzig and in different universities in Germany. He ended up with honorary doctorates from St. Andrews and Oxford and just various places. Very accomplished scholar who was engaged in a number of the big debates in the 20th century. But this is one of the works that he wrote that has become kind of a standard text on this question of the historical basis of infant baptism. Now, one thing that I should point out, Jeremias in this book is to some extent dealing with the theological and biblical questions of what does the text of Scripture say, what are the reasons that early practitioners of infant baptism gave for practicing infant baptism, or conversely, reasons that people gave against the practice of infant baptism, but he's not primarily putting forward sort of one theology of baptism. So this is not, even though he's a Lutheran himself, this is not a kind of Lutheran argument for infant baptism, nor is it a kind of Presbyterian argument or a Roman Catholic argument for infant baptism. He's really trying to restrict himself to the question of when was infant baptism practiced? What did that practice look like? And what were the reasons that the people who were practicing it at that time gave for the practice? Now, in doing that, there's going to be some arguments that are familiar to Presbyterians or Lutherans or different people from different traditions, but he's not primarily trying to lay out a kind of creedal or denominational argument, I guess I should say, for infant baptism. He's trying to kind of look at the history. So how does he do that? Well, what he does in this book is to cover both the documentary evidence. So in other words, he's looking at the writings that we have from early church fathers, and then also the inscriptionary evidence or archaeological evidence that we can piece together to see what was the practice of the church in early centuries in terms of whether or not they ever baptized infants. And so he kind of breaks that bigger topic down into smaller chunks, which I think is helpful. So the first chapter is looking at the baptism of children of parents who were joining the church in the earliest period. So he's kind of trying to go back to again what we see not only in the time after the apostles, but what can we even piece together about the practice of baptism and infant baptism in particular in the time of the apostles themselves. So he looks at the household baptisms in Acts, for example, or some of the other statements about baptism in the New Testament, and brings that into conversation with what we know about baptism as it was practiced amongst Jews at the time of Christ and before the time of Christ. What would that ceremony have meant to them? How was it practiced? Who was baptized? That kind of thing. And then looking at the pieces of evidence we have to determine when a family is joining the church, were their babies baptized as well? That's kind of the first question that he's looking at. And I'll give you his conclusions here at the end. Let me just kind of walk through the questions that he investigates. The second chapter, he's then looking at the baptism of children who were born to Christian parents in the earliest period. So the first chapter is if you have a family coming into the church, what happens to the children? The second chapter is if you have a family that's already part of the church and a child is born, what happens to that child? And so he goes through a number of the key New Testament texts, 1 Corinthians 7:14, Acts 21:21, Mark 10:13 through 16, and the parallel passages in the Synoptic Gospels, and then looks at a number of other, again, inscriptionary evidences from, especially looks at like headstones and things. We can see funeral monuments and headstones from Christian children who died at a certain age, and sometimes we can get evidence of when they were baptized based on that. It's not always clear. Sometimes it's very clear. Sometimes it's not clear. Sometimes it's ambiguous, but he tries to lay all of that out for us to try to answer this question of what was happening to children in these different circumstances. And then he kind of zooms out of that and tries to bring the story up to speed, because he's, in the first two chapters, he's really trying to look at like the first and second century, that kind of the time of the New Testament and the generation afterward, and trying to piece together what we can know about baptism from those times. Now, if you've done any work in that time period, you'll know we don't have nearly the level of documentary evidence that we do in later centuries. So when you hit the third and especially the fourth century after Constantine, there's an explosion of sources, although there's still a lot that we don't have and don't know even today. So much has been lost to time, but there's more to work with later on than there is earlier on. So in the first couple of chapters, he's really just limiting himself to the New Testament and the century or so after that. And then in chapter 3, he's trying to kind of bring it up through the 3rd century, where you begin to have more evidence. And he looks at that evidence geographically. First, he looks to the east to see what evidence we have there. And his argument there is that there's not as much documentary evidence from the east as we would like, but he goes through what we see there in Asia Minor, in Egypt, in Palestine, in Syria, and then he turns to the Western Church and says, what do we see there in Greece, Italy, Gaul, Africa, so on and so forth. Then he talks about the early 4th century. So if you know your church history, this would be the time when Constantine famously is converted at the beginning of the 4th century. Later on in the century, Christianity becomes not only legal, but it becomes the official religion of the empire, so it begins to have cultural sway. Large groups of people are coming into it, and he looks at what he calls the baptismal crisis that emerged out of that. Because, here we kind of get to his conclusion, which he has very helpfully laid out. Chapter 5 is the conclusion, and it's literally 1 page long, so he just sort of recaps his whole argument in a page, which is handy. And what he in essence does is say, okay, I've tried to sort of lay this out, looking at the New Testament evidence, looking at the documentary evidence of writings of church fathers, letters, sermons, things like that, looking at the manuals for worship or membership, things like that we have from the early church. So looking at that documentary evidence, and then also looking at the inscriptionary evidence and archaeological evidence from the earliest centuries and from the church geographically. And what is his argument at the end of the day? His argument at the end of the day is that a thorough examination, here I'm quoting from his conclusion, a thorough examination of all the sources makes it quite clear that in this whole period of 4 centuries, there were to be found only 2 theologians who advocated a postponement of baptism. In other words, he's saying, as he looks at the evidence and as he kind of walks through it, the overwhelming consensus is infant baptism is what was practiced. If you were a family who was coming into the church, not only you, but your children would be baptized. If you were a Christian family who was already part of the church and you were having children, those children would typically be baptized at a very young age as infants, as children. And there was only 2 fathers that he found who clearly argued for a postponement of that to an older age. So Tertullian and Gregory of Nazianzus. Now what he goes on to develop in the book, and he recaps this in his conclusion, is that as he puts it, neither of the 2 above mentioned advocates of postponement of baptism, so he's talking here about Tertullian and Gregory of Nazianzus, neither of them are offering any theological justification for that. In other words, their argument is not it is theologically illegitimate to baptize infants. Their argument is more along the lines of prudence or propriety. Gregory says they should be old enough that they can sort of take in something of the mystery, they can remember it, it'll help them later in their life, that kind of thing. Tertullian similarly appeals to the innocence of children. He says, well, baptism is there, in his view, to wash away original sin. It's tied in with regeneration. Why would you do that early on when they haven't really sinned? Let them grow up and come to know something of sin and come to have a sense of salvation, and then they can be baptized, and baptism will really be beneficial for them. And that kind of idea is the basis for what he develops in chapter 4, which is the crisis. What he talks about there is that there is a period in the history of the early church. It's not the earliest church, but it's later on in the 4th century, for example, where you'll find a number of influential figures. Gregory of Nazianzus is one. I think Gregory of Nyssa is another, who are raised in Christian households, and they have Christian parents, and they aren't baptized until they're adults. And you might say, okay, well, what's going on there? Clearly, this is a knock against infant baptism. However, what Jeremias shows is that the reasoning for that is nothing like the arguments of Credo Baptist in the modern era. The argument is actually more like this. The kind of common assumption is that baptism washes away original sin. And then when you sin beyond that, you're adding to your sin. And so the thought process is, if you're a parent, okay, if I have an 8-day-old infant and I baptize them, then they are made clean, their sin is washed away. But then if they go on to grow up and they sin more and more, then those sins have not been washed away, and I'm putting them at moral peril. And anyone who's raised kids, anyone who's raised teenagers and young people knows there's a lot of struggle, there's a lot of sin, there's a lot of issues that come up. So the kind of thought process, almost at a kind of, he puts it very strongly. He says there's a magical misunderstanding of baptism. That's how he puts it on the last page of his conclusion. That magical misunderstanding of baptism that says, ooh, I want to let my kids kind of get through their wild years and then receive baptism so those sins can be washed away and dealt with. That's what drives this kind of crisis where you see this shift. And it's after, Constantine's converted, Christianity becomes the religion of the empire, then you see swaths of the church who are thinking about baptism in this way. And that prompts a number of, theological reflections on what baptism means and what it does and all these types of things that then kind of corrects that practice later on. So when you move into the Middle Ages, everyone agrees infant baptism is the norm at that point. Now, there's all sorts of questions, and he acknowledges this, that this study might raise about the theology of infant baptism in the early church. And as you can see, infant baptism was often, not as infant baptism I should say, was often connected to the way that the early church thought about the gospel, thought about regeneration, thought about salvation and sin and forgiveness, all of these kinds of things. And so this is a study that can prompt further studies. There's more reflections and questions that come up. But I think one of the virtues of this book is that it's very focused. It really says, I just want to look at the historical evidence, the primary source evidence for how the early church practiced baptism in relation to infants. And he does that very systematically. I appreciate the fact that he looks at the documentary and the inscriptionary evidence. And again, he's writing as a scholar, trying to be dispassionate. He's not giving us a kind of Lutheran theology of this. He's just trying to uncover what was going on in the first few centuries, the first 4 centuries, and how can that help us to understand what was the practice as we have these conversations today. So this is a book that I think if you are interested in this question, if you've been digging into this, if you're trying to understand the historical component, this is a good book to read. This is often a book, as you read other more popular books on baptism and infant baptism, you'll often find this book cited in the footnotes. That's why I picked it up. I had seen the title so many times in other books. I thought I'm going to go back and read this book. And I think the virtue of this is he's not primarily quoting from or referencing other secondary works. He's giving us the firsthand evidence that we can then go follow up with ourselves, but he's quoting straight from the sources such as we have them. Although, of course, everyone has to recognize as we engage in historical discussions, we never have all the sources we would want, and there's always a work of interpreting the sources just as there is interpreting the scripture. So this is not the final word on this topic. In fact, this book kind of prompted a little back and forth. He wrote this, like I said, in 1958 in German, and came out in 1960 in English. Kurt Aland, who is another New Testament scholar, wrote a book kind of in response to this, I think in 1962. And then Jeremias wrote a follow-up response to Aland's book called The Origins of Infant Baptism, a further study in reply to Kurt Aland, which I've not read yet. This is even shorter. It's, I think, 80, 90 pages. So I'll probably read this at some point. I don't know if I'll do it right now, but I'll read it at some point, and I'll give a review when I do that. But there's some back and forth there. But if you're looking for those first-hand accounts and evidence of infant baptism in the first 4 centuries, this is the work you've got to read. You've got to interact with. You've got to do justice to. And I think it's a good work. It is a scholarly work. There's going to be times where he's quoting Greek or Latin without translation. So if you're not familiar with the languages, that may be a little bit of a stumbling block, but there's still plenty you can get at, even just as an English reader, with a little bit of patience. So something that I would recommend for anyone interested in this topic: Infant Baptism in the First 4 Centuries by Joachim Jeremias.